Right? And the starting point here, right? We're trying to work toward these bigger puzzles in international political economy. We're trying to work toward this idea, like, why do we see barriers to trade, right? Why do we see tariffs and quotas? What's at stake when we negotiate these free trade agreements? So we started with supply and demand, and now we're looking at comparative advantage. So supply and demand is going to sort of tell you how you get to a market price and when you get shortages and when you get surpluses. So those are going to be really important concepts. We also have to understand, like, how does trade make people better off? Why do we trade in the first place? And so that's what we're working on today. We'll anchor, how is it that trade is creating wealth? Why is it that, at least in theory, trade can make all countries better off? Not all individuals. We'll talk about winners and losers within countries, and specialization leads to some people losing out. But at the national level, free trade can make every country better off. So then, if we understand who wins and loses within countries, we can get at, well, then why do some people within those countries really want to be protected from free trade, and why is that a reasonable thing for them to want? So that's where we're headed. Those are the political questions we're headed toward. We've got to anchor this economic piece in order to talk about the politics. Okay. And the principle of comparative advantage is super, super powerful. There was once a fellow mathematician, Stanislav Ulam, who sort of challenged a Nobel laureate in economics, Paul Samuelson, to say, look, just tell me one thing in all of social sciences, which is both true and non-trivial. And he's being pretty dismissive of the social sciences, which maybe is justified. And Paul Samuelson's answer was the principle of comparative advantage. That to Samuelson, and I think he's not wrong here, like, this is one of the most important things that social science has ever figured out. So let's learn about it. Let's start with identifying factors of production, right? Where do goods and services come from? How do we make stuff? And you start with, so factors of production are ways to talk about different inputs. What do you need to put together in order to get a good or a service, right? Anything that's used to produce a good or a service is a factor of production. And we can lump things into three broad categories here. We can talk about land as a primary factor of production, right? So particularly, in agriculture, this is super important, right? If you want to grow some wheat, right, you need some land, right? And so we have land that is more or less fertile. We have land in different climate zones, right? We have some land with oil sitting underneath it that we can pull out, or with different minerals sitting underneath it, right? So we have land as a factor of production in a variety of industries, but especially we sort of think about, like, land as a really important factor of production in mining and farming, somewhat less important in, say, manufacturing. Okay, you still need a piece of land for your factory to sit on, but that's not a big part of what goes into manufacturing in most cases, right? Okay. And then you usually need some labor, right? You need some person hours of work, right? So if you want to grow that wheat, right, somebody's doing the planting and the tilling and the harvesting and all of this sort of stuff, right? So you've got some labor. And you may also have some capital, right? And capital we can think about as like financial capital and cash, but that tool that the farmer's using, if the farmer's, if you give the farmer a little bit of capital, say you give them a hoe, right, that makes the farmer more productive than if they're just digging in the dirt with their hands, right? But then if you give that farmer a plow and a horse, you give them more capital, they're even more productive with that labor. And if you give them a tractor, they're even more productive with that labor, right? So capital is anything that helps you produce more product with less land and labor, that helps you use land and labor more efficiently. Then that's capital, right? And so, kind of the archetypes here, like money and equipment and tools, but you'll see we have these three broad buckets here: land, labor, capital, and kind of shoehorn a bunch of things in here. And here's where we push in education and knowledge. We kind of shoehorn it into capital as human capital, right? And so we'll talk about this a lot, that when you, as a college graduate, go out on the labor market, you're being paid for your labor, but you're also being paid like a rental price on your human capital, right? That they're leasing your human capital as well when they hire you. So human capital goes in that capital bucket, and that's all the knowledge, information, education, know-how, that sort of thing. Okay, so those are the factors of production. And the reason we're starting here is different countries have different amounts of each of these factors of production, a different mix of these factors of production. Now, I'm going to spend very little time here at absolute advantage. We're going to move toward comparative advantage, which is what's really important. But absolute advantage is temporally what we understood first as a sort of humankind, right? So Adam Smith is generally credited with sort of the original understanding of absolute advantage, right? Which is this idea that if a country a country has absolute advantage when it can make a particular good or service using fewer inputs than some other country, right? They're a more efficient producer of something than somebody else. And what Smith's insight was, look, if country A is good at making, boots and country B is really good at making wine, then we can trade boots for wine and make both countries better off. So he said, look, in a world where one country is really good at one thing and another country is really good at another thing, they can trade in a way that makes them both better off. Okay, and that's great, and that is true. But it's not doesn't capture the full magic of trade, not nearly. Right? The principle of comparative advantage, which generally is credited to Ricardo, and came along, and was figured out, I don't know, ballpark 100 years later. I should have checked that before I gave this lecture, but considerably later. Ricardo's insight is that two countries can both benefit from trade, even if one of them has an absolute advantage in everything, right? So even if Great Britain is better at making wine and better at making boots than France, they can still trade productively boots and wine with France and make both of them better off, as long as Britain and France are different. So it's not that each country has to have something they're better at than the other. It's just the two countries have to be different. As long as the countries are different, they can trade in ways that make them both better off. That's the magic of comparative advantage, right? So what matters, what allows countries to trade productively with each other, to trade in ways that make them both better off, is a difference in what we call the marginal rate of transformation, right? And we'll talk about that a lot today, the marginal rate of transformation. And this is the basic idea, is how many units of one thing that I could make do I have to give up in order to make a unit of another thing, right? So if we're working with like wine and cloth, right? Like how many bottles of wine do I have to give up in order to make an extra yard of cloth, right? There's only just so many hours in a day. There's only just so much land in my country. There's always only just so much capital in my country. So if I'm going to take land, labor, and capital away from making wine and produce cloth, how much less wine do I have to accept in order to make, an additional yard of cloth? That's my opportunity cost to make that extra yard of cloth. How much of something else do I have to give up? And that term opportunity cost is one we'll be coming back to a lot in this class. It's really a key concept. It's how much of one thing do I have to give up in order to get something else, right? So this marginal rate of transformation here, we've got an example where we're just going to assign some numbers here. We're going to say that, look, if the United Kingdom took all of their land, labor, and capital for a day and put it all into making wine, they could make 40 bottles of wine, right? But if they took all their land, labor, and capital and put it into making cloth, they could make 40 yards of cloth. I'm sorry, those are the numbers for the United States. The numbers for the United Kingdom are a little bit different, right? If they put all their land, labor, and capital into making wine, they could make 20 bottles. If they put all their land, labor, and capital into making cloth, they can make 10 yards of cloth. So in this case, right, it looks like the United States has an absolute advantage in everything, right? It's a US textbook, so we're going to create a made-up example where the US is awesome at everything, and the Brits are, not quite so hot. But the key thing is that there's a difference, right? In order to figure out whether the US and the UK can trade profitably in this example, it doesn't matter whether the US is better at everything in absolute terms. It just matters, are they different than the UK with respect to their marginal rate of transformation, right? So the US marginal rate of transformation here is 40 to 40, or 1, right? If we want to make 1 extra bottle of wine, we have to give up 1 yard of cloth, right? Or if we want to make 1 extra yard of cloth, we have to give up 1 bottle of wine, right? Okay. And what's important is that this marginal rate of transformation is different than the marginal rate of transformation of the UK, right? So for the UK has to give up, I'm sorry, it's 20 to 10 with a ratio of 2. And you can see I've got a typo on my slide. That's brilliant. Checking your understanding here, right? But 20 to 10, a ratio of 2, right? So if they want to make an extra bottle of wine, they have to give up half a yard of cloth. If they want to make an extra yard of cloth, they have to give up 2 bottles of wine, right? So they have a different marginal rate of transformation. As long as that is true, then then we have a difference here. Okay, and we have an ability to trade in ways that make both countries better off. This is a slide that's going to kind of run us through some of these numbers. It's nice to have for some folks, it's nice to have a numerical example of the way in which a case in which the US has an absolute advantage in both products can still trade profitably with the UK. Right? So if the US is going to shift some of their labor toward cloth, right, where they are relatively better. Let's say they're shifting half of the time that they used to spend making wine. They're going to shift over to cloth. So now they're making 60 yards of cotton and 20 bottles of wine. And let's say that the UK just focuses all their time on wine, which is what they're better on. They specialize completely in wine. So instead of 20 bottles of wine and 10 yards of cloth, they're just dumping all their time into wine production. All right, that's going to get them 40 bottles of wine.
Professor?
So if we swap this, if we allow some trading, right? If we have the UK trading 20 bottles of wine for 15 yards of cloth, to sort of pick one particular sort of terms of trade, right? We can get to a world where the US has 40 bottles of wine and 45 yards of cloth. The UK has 20 bottles of wine and 15 yards of cloth. Both are better off than if they didn't trade, even though the US has an absolute advantage in both things. And that's really the magic of comparative advantages. It allows trade for mutual gain, even when one country is better at both things. And the last piece that we want to connect, here is we want to say, look, okay, this is a toy world, right? So this is a toy world that we've set up with just two products. And we actually, in the real world, we have more than two products, right? We have products that range in degree of specialization. And so what we don't see is just like, okay, specializing in wine versus specializing in cloth. What we see is countries partially specializing, doing mostly things they're slightly better at and trading those things for things they're slightly worse at. And we see kind of a whole range of products. So we've got, it's nice to anchor our understanding of comparative advantage with the little two product, two country world, but there's actually more than two products. Okay. And there's also more than two countries, right? And so you'll get sort of multi-way trade here where you'll get OPEC countries, which are sort of the oil producing countries in the Middle East, exporting oil to Japan. You'll get Japan exporting semiconductors to the US and the US exporting jets to the Middle East. Okay, so you'll get sort of this multi-way trade. But that principle of comparative advantage that we can illustrate with two countries and two products, it's still driving this multi-product, multi-country, sort of multilateral trade. Okay, and the last piece we have to anchor here, and the last thing we're covering in this lecture is who's winning and who's losing within these countries, right? So I've told you that trade between the US and the UK in this toy example can make both countries in the aggregate better off, but it doesn't make every individual better off, right? If you are a British cloth producer, right, in a world of no trade, you're doing okay, right? But you open up to trade with the US and you get wiped out. When the UK goes and specializes completely in wine, that's all these cloth manufacturers who just lost their job. And yeah, okay, the wine industry is booming and maybe they can get hired by a vineyard, but that might mean leaving their job in one part of the country and leaving their home in one part of the country and moving completely across the country to take this different job, uprooting their entire lives, changing every skill they've developed into something new, going from the top of their profession to the bottom of a new profession. Disruption due to trade is really, really unpleasant, right? And we're going to talk about this and how this churn itself is really costly. Similarly, the same thing is going to be happening in the US, even the country that has that absolute advantage in both things. Remember, like the US wine producers, they're more efficient at the British wine producers, but they're about to start losing market share to these British wine producers, right? Where they're going to be, the US is going to be specializing more in cloth. That's going to be the efficient thing to do. Is that wine industry may not collapse entirely, but it's going to go down, right? It's going to shrink. People are going to, again, in the US, lose their jobs in the vineyards and have to take jobs in clothing manufacturing where jobs are available, right? And that dislocation is going to be really hard, right? So while both these countries in the aggregate can be made better off with trading with each other, that only occurs if they specialize, and that process of specialization can be really disruptive and can be really costly. So we'll be, as we move into the politics of this, we're talking a lot about that disruption and how governments try to minimize it and how that maybe doesn't go so well. So that's where we're headed here. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next video.